project I'm going to work on here is a new flattening table. What you see here is my old flattening table. It's the one I used in the last video, and I've used it for other projects in the past. It's good for up to about 2 feet wide, a little more than that, maybe 30 inches, and 12 feet long, which is great for flattening slabs that are of those dimensions, and that's what I've used it for up until this point. But the project I'm going to work on next, and you'll see a little bit at the end, is a new top for my desk, and that desktop is going to be about 3 feet wide, which is more than I can flatten on my current flattening table. And given that I'm going to be using a bit of epoxy to fill some gaps, I'm going to create some unevenness with that epoxy. I'm going to need something that can flatten wider. Don't really have access to shop resources in the area that can flatten something like that for me, so I've got to be able to do it at home with the flattening table. So I'm going to build one. This one I'm going to make for up to about 4 feet wide, so I can really get to just about any size project I want. I'm going to do it with something sort of like a torsion box. So what I've already done is cut off the edges of these 2x6s so that they're perfectly flat, gotten rid of that unevenness that you naturally get with a 2x6. And then I'm going to be slotting them all through here to basically build the grid pattern for the torsion box. So I've got my stop block set, and I'll go through and cut both ends to the exact same length. That way I'm building something that's symmetrical, which is ideal. And this will be the first cut. I can go back and then make the second cut by adjusting the stop block to the opposite end of the thickness of a 2x4, or 2x6 in this case. And that'll give me the perfect width. And then all I've got to do from there is go back in and hollow out the material. For the two long sections, I've taped them together here, so I'm using 2 long sections and then 5 crosses that'll complete the torsion box feature. I've taped these together, that way I can make sure that I cut at the exact same point, and so this way I should get a really good clean build that should be very perfectly spaced. I'm using the full 8-foot length of the 2x4 and the sheet of plywood, which you can see in the background there, and that way I get the most flattening surface possible. And so that makes this a bit of a task. Trying to cut an 8-foot board on a table saw is certainly not the easiest thing, but it's doable, and a little bit of extra care along the way, and certainly using the table saw sled, that's going to just make it way easier to handle and help control everything, make things easier to slide as well. With all the paste wax I've got on the bottom of the table saw sled, it's much easier. So going through here, creating one of the slots in both of these sections. You can see I've already got a couple of them cut in on one of their locations, and I'll continue to go through and cut all of them in this manner. That way I've got all 5 notched in, perfectly equal on both boards. The worst sections to cut were definitely the ends, so you can see here really having to be careful holding both sides of that board down pretty tightly. Maybe it's not obvious, but having to hold it pretty firmly. Otherwise, with the length of the board sticking off the end, it becomes just a heavy cantilever, and it really wanted to tip the whole thing off of the table saw. So being very careful here. Still trying to keep my body out of the way. That way, if anything pops off as I'm cutting these sections and these little slices out. I've had a couple of those pop through. I don't have a great, quote-unquote guard on the back of my table saw sled. And so when these little slices sometimes come loose, they can shoot back, and they're certainly not comfortable. I'm not going to do any damage with something this small, but not comfortable to take one of those in the stomach. So trying to keep my body out of the way and make sure I hog out as much as possible. I can go back through later with the chisel and clean up what's left here, and not using a flat top blade, so either way I'm going to have to do a little bit of cleanup. So once all those notches or slots are cut in, can go back with the chisel, and you can see with pine these just pop straight out. There's really almost no effort to get them cleaned out of the gaps. You just pop them through. And then just a quick touch up on the chisel to flatten it out, make sure there's no little humps left. Obviously, to make sure that this is going to be sitting flush and sitting even at all 5 locations. Want to make sure you got a nice flat surface, nothing sticking up that's going to cause one of the locations to stick up or sit uneven at the surface. One thing I should mention, these slots were all cut in with a depth equal to half the height of these boards. So all the boards are cut to the same height, and then the cut is half the depth. And that way, when they mesh together or slot together, I'll get exactly a flush fit on the top and bottom. And when I go to lay the plywood on top, that's exactly what I want. I want a nice flush top surface that I can use so that the plywood sits flush and is well supported. One thing I'll get to later, anywhere that it doesn't sit perfectly flush, I can either go back and trim a little bit out, or if it's a little bit subflush, I can just make a small adjustment by hand, holding the boards in place, and then run a screw in to lock it in at the exact location that I want it. So it really gives a good amount of flexibility, but also makes it a really good flat surface. And the flatter that surface is, the less you're going to have to deal with in terms of putting shims and wedges in. When you go to flatten, which can just make it a less enjoyable job. The flatter you start with, the easier it is to flatten whatever it is you're working through. On the 8-foot boards, it would just too much to try to run them through the table saw, and so the furthest out locations, cutting by hand here, not too hard to cut with a saw. Of course, my saw skills are not outstanding, and so everything is more difficult when you're still practicing and learning, but cut them through, get a nice straight clean cut, and then can go and clean that back out with the chisel just the same way as I would have anyways. And so resulting with the same outcome, with the same finish, just a little bit safer than trying to hold a 8-foot board with 6.5 feet hanging off the edge. One of the good things about building a project like this, especially one that is for myself, is it is a good chance to practice some of these skills. So using the hand tools, this is a great time to do a little bit of that work. And, especially in this case where it's a shop tool effectively that I'm building, if the finish isn't perfect, that's okay. And so using that as an opportunity to develop the skill set is really a perfect opportunity. It's a perfect chance. The only one that's going to know if it's not perfect is you, and you have the ability to correct for any small mistakes that you may make along the way. And so it works out really well. I try to make sure that I do something when I'm building these little shop projects that is new or different than what I've done in the past, to try to make sure that I'm continuing to develop and using those opportunities to get some practice in. Once I've got the locations notched up, I'll go back, just create a little bit of an indent with the chisel on both sides. And by doing this, kind of gives a nice clean split point so that when I go to knock the block out, it'll pop straight out real nice and clean. So both sides, notch it in a little bit, just give that indentation with the chisel. And then when I've got that in place, can come back and a couple of hits with the mallet. It really doesn't take much at this point, and that wedge will pop right out. You can see there, pop straight through. You get a pretty clean surface. Just a little touch with the chisel to flatten out any roughness, any strands that may not have cut through clean, and it's all good. Originally, when I was planning out the work on this, I had intended to do the end sections, which is where the guide rails will sit in the 5-foot crosses. by hand. So I was going to do it the same way that I did for the ends of the 8-foot sections, cut it with the saw, and then clean it out with the chisel. But at this point, I'd made a number of cuts in the table saw and felt pretty confident that I could do it both cleanly and safely, which is pretty much the most important parts here. And I'd also got a new guide tool for a miter gauge and wanted to give that a little spin, so connected that onto my miter gauge and figured I'd use that to run these through. And as you can see here, pretty simple, pretty easy, no big issues. I did again have to hold it pretty firmly just because of the amount of material cantilevered over the edge, but didn't have any issues. Cut them up pretty clean, pretty simple. You can see that I've left an edge there sort of open where I made those cuts, and I'm gonna go back and add a block in. I found when I built my first flattening table, I left material on the ends, and those sections just snapped off so easily because of the grain orientation. Really not a strong way to do it, and so by screwing a piece on after, I can get a much better grain orientation and clean things up. With the structure assembled, I can now work on attaching the plywood to the base. In a small shop, putting a sheet of plywood on top of a base that's almost as big as the shop, definitely not ideal. So at each location, using a countersink bit and the drill bit, getting a nice clean flush joint. Want to make sure that those screws are countersunk so that nothing sticks out. You can see there, brought in my 6-foot level and really had no gaps. Really a nice, good flat surface. So exactly what I'd hoped for and exactly what I'd use the torsion box style design. Good support everywhere and really good flatness. As I mentioned before, had a lot of issues with the ends of my first flattening table structure. A lot of those little end bits broke off, and so you can see there just adding on a more idealized grain orientation bit for each end cap, and that'll hold the rails in place. So with the main portion of the table done, now it's time to build the new sled. Obviously, with the wider flattening table, also need a wider sled to carry the router, and so cutting up the pieces now, using 3/4 ply for all that. I will go back and reference the top of the flattening table. I just used a 3/8 ply. It doesn't need to be super thick, and the base provides all the strength it needs. So really, just need a nice, good flat surface. So the 3/8 is great for that. But with the sled, because it's so long, being 5 feet long, that's a lot that needs to be managed. You don't want that sled flexing, otherwise you're never going to get a good flat surface. And so that 3/4 inch ply will really give you a better surface. One thing I did here that I did not do on the first sled that I built was I made it quite a bit wider, and this will allow a couple things. Number one, it will allow me to actually connect my dust collection to the router while I'm working. With the other setup I've got, it's so tight that the dust collection hose really doesn't fit in, and I can't attach it, and so it just makes an even worse mess. With this one, it's wide enough that it'll fit, but just tight enough that it won't let the router spin freely, so it'll catch it just before it can spin. So mistakes happen. Luckily, this one isn't a super expensive one. Trying out a new saw when I was cutting this, a new jigsaw, and I was getting a lot of blade wander as I got up through this section here. Quite a bit more than I was hoping for. Not sure if it's a blade issue, a saw issue, just a little bit of adjustment that I need to make on the saw, but ultimately ended up getting too much wander where I had to come back in and cut more out of this unit than I wanted to. And what's happened now is this section is so thin in the width direction that it flexes as the router goes over it, which means I'm going to get an uneven cut when I am surfacing boards. So this piece has to come out. I'm going to have to replace it. And as I'm doing that, I've found that I've probably got about 3 inches of play between the end and the runner. So I'm actually going to take 3/8 out of all the pieces as well. and then put it back together, and that should give me a nice snug fit so I don't get any wobble or play or binding as I'm sliding the unit along the rails. A little bit of follow-up, I did find that the blade I used, which was the blade that came with the saw, just wasn't a good blade. It just didn't ever sit into its nest properly and therefore didn't cut straight. So using a blade that I had from my old jigsaw, everything was fine and could proceed with that. As you can see here, got a new toy. Circumstances worked out in my favor, was able to pick up a track saw. Let me tell you, these fast tool track saws have incredible power. I've never felt anything like it. The ease at which I could cut through this plywood was just incredible, even compared to the regular circular saw I'd used, the DeWalt saw I'd used up until now. This is just, it's such another level, a really beautiful tool to work with. With the main blank cut down to size, I could go back. Actually, I'm using the same jigsaw after I'd done a couple of practice cuts. Like I said, found that the blade was just not sitting properly, and so grabbed the blade that I had from my other jigsaw and popped it in, and everything nested properly. Everything was seating properly, and as you can see here, getting really nice clean cuts. Really no issues. So blade one, tossed in the garbage bin, don't need that anymore, and I'll stick with the other blades that I had already. Recut that section out, got a really good finish on this one, exactly the width that I wanted, just a little bit bigger than the flattening bits that I used, so I've got a bit of play there. And then I'll go back here now and clean anything up with a sanding block. Because of the jigsaw, you get a lot of rough edges, don't want that, don't want to catch a splinter or anything, and so the whole sled I sanded down. Going back here now with the paste wax, and I'll just coat the whole sled in paste wax, especially the surfaces that are going to be in contact either with my hands or with the router base. And so that whole base I've given a really good coat of paste wax, and the whole bottom as well. Even though it doesn't all ride on the rails, coated with paste wax. So you can see here a little preview of the next project to come. This is the desktop that I'm working on. That is why I built this flattening table. Had the two levels set up there to make sure that everything was sitting flat and also sitting parallel to each other, which it was. And now just a little view of how the flattening table works. You can see there I've got the dust flushing hooked up, which is fantastic. Still a lot of mess being created, and didn't have any leftover vapor barrier to create a little wall like I've got on my other sled. So something I'll have to work on, grabbing some more vapor barrier to clean that up and help control some of the dust. My shop is a complete mess right now. Nevertheless, everything's working, so I can start to use the flattening table that I've been building here. You can see again the project I've got coming up, the new desktop there. I had to use a clamp to hold the router, which might not have been the best idea I've ever had, but it actually worked quite well to reach across. It's such a wide flattening table that I couldn't reach super well, but everything worked out well and gave actually a pretty surprisingly clean finish. Quick shout out to John, who commented on my last video. John, I'll just note that I'd already filmed this before you made your comment, and so I'll have to try on the next round to run the router in the other direction, sort of perpendicular to where I'm running it here. Appreciate everybody watching. We'll see you next time.